On today's episode of TYT Interviews, my guest is Sarah Jaffe, an independent journalist covering labor, social movements, politics, gender, pop culture, and the author of the current book, Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt. Sarah Jaffe, welcome to TYT Interviews.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Glad to do it. We got some things I want to talk about, so let's jump into it.
All right.
So Necessary Trouble is a book that reports on the wave of protest movements in the United States in the past few years, especially since the economic crisis of 2008. Everyone knows about the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street and the Occupy movement, and a few people know about what happened in Wisconsin. But this book has a lot more in it. So what else is going on in America other than those three movements that I just mentioned?
I mean, I think everybody also knows about Black Lives Matter, so that's obviously in there. But I also talk about some parts of the climate justice movement that get a little bit less attention. I talk about the Chicago teachers strike from 2012 and the follow-up to that, including the pending second Chicago teachers strike, which may be going on soon. We talk about the Walmart workers organizing in strikes and the Fight for 15, the fast food workers organizing. What else? Goodness, there's a lot.
Yeah, Moral Mondays.
Moral Mondays, absolutely. And the Moral Mondays that spread outside of North Carolina to be in, that there's Moral Mondays in Illinois and New York, as well as in North Carolina and Georgia. There's a lot going on all over the country all the time. And I just got back from North Dakota where there's a pipeline blockade going on right now. So it continues after the book went to press.
We might get an update from you a little later on the North Dakota situation. But
yeah, absolutely.
I was struck, I read your book, Necessary Trouble, and I was impressed by the effectiveness of the Walmart movement, and I didn't know much about it. So I want to dive deeper into that.
Yeah.
Can you recall for our viewers what I refer to as the Walmart movement, or I don't know how they phrased it, Walmart. What was going on there, and what did they accomplish?
So the labor movement had been trying to organize Walmart basically since Walmart, started to expand. And they'd really constantly just hit walls. When they had even managed to get workers interested in organizing, Walmart would close stores. Or famously, when the meat cutters in one store in Texas, it was like 9 or 10 people actually won a union election, Walmart eliminated meat cutters from all of its stores around the country. So they were really vicious about stamping out unions and union drives that worked the way traditional union drives do, which is win elections store by store, department by department. And so labor really was trying to figure out something else it could do. And there were several experiments that sort of worked a little bit or didn't work really at all. And then in 2012, following Occupy, following sort of this redefinition of, I would say like a redefinition of class struggle in this country, it was a lot easier to talk about the fact that the Walton family owns as much wealth, this one family, as the bottom 50% of America, and how ridiculous that is that their employees, when they are hoarding that much, and they're the third largest employer in the world behind the American Army and the Chinese Army, Walmart. That's direct employees for Walmart. That doesn't even include the people who work at places that supply things to Walmart. And so what they did was this sort of distributed organizing campaign that wasn't aimed at winning a union election store by store. It was aimed at getting the workers together who wanted to stand up and fight for better conditions at the company, connecting them via the internet, helping them organize one another. And they started out with sort of one-day strikes at a bunch of different stores, actions on Black Friday, which is the biggest retail day of the year. And though the company will never admit it, Walmart gave its workers around the country a raise last year. They're supposed to be up to $10 an hour right now, which of course is not nearly enough, but it's something. And it's also, they've affected things like the company's policy for pregnant workers. And this is all done with a tiny handful of Walmart's million-plus employees being willing to go out on strike.
Putting on your labor historian hat, so Walmart is using these pretty hardcore tactics to suppress union drives.
Right.
Would that have been possible 60, 70, 80 years ago? Or has changed in our country that allows Walmart legally to suppress these union drives?
Walmart was always very, very particular about, we don't want unions, we don't want worker organization. We are going to have this built into our company ideology that you don't need that. We have an open door policy, which means that workers can go complain, which workers used to joke about the open door policy, meaning that they would be kicked out the open door if they complained. But this was a really, really intense part of this company in particular, as well as a broader thing that's happened across the last 30, 40 years. And, the labor movement, back in the day, union busting was like with guns. I wrote a piece for the LA Times about how the original Labor Day was created after the Pullman railroad strike was brutally crushed because the president called in the National Guard. And then he was like, oh my God, workers have votes. And so created a Labor Day as a national holiday to try to appease labor after that. And so, in the 30s, when you got the New Deal and you got labor protections and law for some workers, not all workers. And that has been slowly expanded and then retracted over the years. So retail workers were originally not even covered by labor law, by the National Labor Relations Act, things like that. And so what happened was that labor sort of thought like, okay, we have a deal here. We will organize and we will create unions and we will get steadily increasing wages in exchange for, working hard, working a 40-hour week and producing a whole lot of profits for the boss. And the thing that happened was that labor accepted that deal and the boss never really accepted that deal. And so this is why we have this amazing anti-union consulting industry now, because it's been slowly perfected ever since.
I was just asked a few weeks ago what the origin of Labor Day was. I wish I had known about your LA Times article. Now I'm going to go find it.
I will send it to you.
Oh, well, thank you. I see in your book, it's almost like a hall of fame of people who stand up. And I don't have all the names here, but there's the Reverend Barber in North Carolina, and I don't know if I'm going to pronounce her name right, but Shwama Sawant in Seattle.
Shwama Sawant, yeah.
Barbara Smalley McMahon in North Carolina. At Walmart, there was Venencia Luna and Cynthia Murray, and Alex Hanna in Wisconsin. First, so to me, this is a hall of fame of people who are trying to make change in this country. Yeah. Do you keep up with these people? Do you know what they're all doing now? Can we expect bigger things, more from them in the future, or do they just go back to their lives once they've accomplished, the limited protests that they were doing?
My favorite line in the book, and somebody just asked me about this because it's about to be tomorrow, in fact, the 5th anniversary of Occupy Wall Street, from Kat Salonik, who was an Occupy organizer and an Occupy Homes organizer in Minnesota, and she's now a labor organizer, who said that, Occupy was like a dandelion, when you pick up the dandelion and you blow it out and the seeds go everywhere and they sprout all over the place. And then those grow up and they turn into another one and you blow on that and you see the seeds go out everywhere. So I mentioned I was in North Dakota. I was in North Dakota with Mary Clinton and Nalini Stamp, both of whom I met during Occupy Wall Street. We saw other people there that we knew from Occupy who were living in the camp and helping organize direct actions. There are people from each of these movements, I think, that are moving on to the next ones. But also I should be real about the fact that, in the book, I talked to Alex Hanna about how she basically stepped back after Wisconsin. Scott Walker was reelected. He survived the recall and then was reelected again. And so that was really hard. And people actually do, step back when there's a loss, try to figure out where they can fit in next. I'm sure a lot of people out there are doing that after Bernie Sanders didn't win the primary right now. People are kind of trying to figure out where they fit in next. Movements sort of ebb and flow. They don't go on a straight incline. And so there have been quiet moments. I've been telling this story a lot about how I was trying to propose this book in the summer of 2014, and it was very quiet, and publishers were mostly like, I don't know if there's anything really. I think they didn't really believe me that there were, a steadily increasing wave of protest movements happening. And then in August 2014, Michael Brown was killed and the city of Ferguson rose up, and suddenly people understood what I was talking about. And right now, of course, it's not that hard to convince anybody that there are protest movements going on anymore.
Sure. On that note, I was going to get to this later, but it's a good segue. Mm-hmm. Remember, I think it was in 1999, an anti-globalization protest in Seattle that turned quite violent against property. and I think many people were kind of stunned by that uh, anti-globalization, or the ill effects of globalization, was not a big subject. It wasn't on everybody's minds until that protest. And I thought that what happened, they got so much news coverage, and the property damage was so surprising that people said, "Whoa, wait a minute, what has got these people all worked up?"
Yeah.
First of all, do you concur with my interpretation or my recollection of the effect of that anti-globalization protest in Seattle? And it's not in the book, but do you find that was an important part in the contemporary American protest movements?
Yeah, I think that the moment in Seattle was one that, I was 19, I was in college when that happened. I remember going like, oh my goodness, what is this? Because I was really not connected to anything that was going on other than, some feminist friends and I protested a frat party when I was in college. That was about it. And so it was this moment that it was suddenly like, what happened? And, I think that, there were some Starbucks windows broken. There were a lot of people tear gassed. There were a lot of people arrested. There were a lot of, including reporters. I was just talking about this because Amy Goodman is facing charges again. And she was one of the people who was arrested there trying to report on this. That it was really, it was a really intense moment, but also it worked. They managed to shut down the summit that was going on in Seattle. And so, that was this thing that we sort of expected, or I think that I shouldn't say we, I didn't at the time, that people sort of expected would expand and grow in this country. And it kind of faded, especially after 9/11, when the whole focus became, national security or opposing the wars. But I think that there's a lot of groundwork from that also in what's going on now. A lot of the tactics and the structures that went into, say, Occupy Wall Street were taken from the anti-globalization movement, or the alter globalization movement, as some people call it, that went on, around the world. And in Seattle in particular, because Seattle has been, Seattle elected Shama Sawant, an open socialist, to their city council. Seattle was the first major city to vote for $15 an hour. Outside of Seattle, where they protested the Shell oil tanker that was going to go up to do Arctic Circle drilling, that then, after a bunch of those protests, led to Obama canceling drilling leases up there. We really saw that there was groundwork in that specific place, but also that spread nationwide from that moment. There are a lot of moments that I think we can look back on in the 90s and 2000s. I mentioned Hurricane Katrina as another one, and the Day Without an Immigrant Strike. Things like that really didn't snowball the way we've seen things snowball in recent years, but that trained some organizers and laid some seeds for what we're seeing now.
Right. Okay, so you've mentioned the North Dakota situation 3 times now, so we better get to it. So you were there just a week ago or so. What did you observe, and what's the current situation or status of that?
I literally got back yesterday, so it's like the only thing on my mind right now. So I apologize, but it's really it's a really incredible scene out there. You sort of go out and you drive, an hour north of south of Bismarck on the highway, and it's just this, everything is very hilly, and there's not a lot of people and not a lot of houses, just some cows and buffalo. And then you drive over this rise, and there's this camp, and it's tents and it's teepees, and there are all these flags down the road from all of the different Native nations, from other places that people have brought their flags to add. So, somebody was saying there are more flags there than there are at the United Nations. And what it is it's a camp. There's sort of 3 camps, actually, that they set up to keep an eye on and to blockade the Dakota Access Pipeline. So this is, another one. It's not quite as big as the Keystone XL pipeline would have been, but the groundwork from that movement, and particularly among Indigenous people who were involved in that movement, has really flowered into this huge, huge camp that is the coming together of all of these different people from around the country. And most importantly, it's led by, and it is, it's entirely guided by and shaped by the Indigenous people who are there. It's right on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, or right over the border from the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. And it's just kind of an incredible moment. There are people who are doing direct actions, who are locking down to the construction equipment. And there are people who are praying and coming together, and they were talking about it as just kind of a space where they can decolonize themselves, where this is it's becoming more than just a place to blockade a pipeline, but to really think about what it has meant and what it means to be Native in this moment, and how they can actually come together. So it's just a fascinating space to be.
But correct me on the news. Didn't the government or the administration put a pause on the construction?
The Obama administration asked voluntarily for the company to halt construction on the area 20 miles around the reservation. So what's happening this week? So I went up on Monday, and each day this week so far, there were people locking down on the equipment in the places where they're still constructing, because they haven't stopped constructing the pipeline. They've stopped constructing the pipeline on the place that's right near where the protest camp is. Or excuse me, they would get very upset. They are water protectors. They do not want to be called protesters. But so the pipeline is going on, and this is like a temporary pause, and it's entirely voluntary. So basically, if the company decides it wants to start up digging right next to the camp, they can. There's nothing actually stopping them other than these people who are locking down and these people who are there camped out and watching.
Do you have a sense of what's going to happen, how this is all going to end?
I mean, there are still legal challenges. There was a court case that went against them, the tribe, on Friday, the same day that the Corps of Engineers made this request for them to stop construction. And they're appealing that. There are other legal challenges. And of course, the people in the camp say they're staying all winter, which is a really serious commitment, because North Dakota winters are no joke. And so they're thinking about, moving from tents and teepees to more sturdy housing that you can have fires inside, that you can actually heat. And what that looks like over the winter, which is also a harder time for the company to be digging into the frozen ground, obviously. So, we'll see. But the people there, it's still there. The camp is still very big, and people were still coming in day after day, even after the administration made this request. So people are very much not taking this as a win, but taking this as like a sign that they can win.
Right. That's... So moving off the pipeline, I was also interested in the conflicts, the unique conflicts with the global warming protest movements. Particularly the class of people who still see it as very abstract. They may have sympathy to fight carbon dioxide emissions, but they see the whole thing as very abstract and not directly related to their lives and their immediate concerns. What can you talk a little bit about that, and how can the global warming movement bring those people in?
Yeah, I think that what's happening that I tried to write about in the book is that people are seeing the connections with their like everyday lives to these things, right? So you have to sort of be able to say that, like, yes, like this pipeline, if this pipeline goes through, the result will be an increase in emissions on this level. But also you have to say, like, this pipeline is going to go under the river that provides water to millions of people. And those things are connected. And so, there's a quote in the book from Michael Johnson, who is, he's a organizer with South Bronx Unite, which is a group that, among other things, has been fighting the location of diesel truck industries in the South Bronx in New York. And so I got to know him when they were running a campaign about Fresh Direct, which is a grocery store delivery company. And, Fresh Direct is their name, but if you live in the South Bronx and they're going to be bringing a ton of diesel trucks through your neighborhood every day, the end result is anything but fresh. And, those are literally the emissions, right? And it's not just, and what Michael Johnson says is like the first line of climate change, the first line of these emissions is that we can't breathe. As the South Bronx has the highest asthma rates in the country because all of these things are cited there because of the, 6, I think, new dumps created in the last 10 years or so. 4 of them are in their neighborhood. That this is what happens when you decide that certain people are expendable, and therefore you can locate all of these things that pollute in their neighborhoods. They are the front lines of that. And you have to actually think about it in terms of people and not sort of in terms of like the polarized caps that most of us will never see are melting. But what's going to happen in your neighborhood? When Hurricane Sandy hit New York, the subways flooded. And that video was so just amazing to watch
Right.
when you could see the water rushing into the subway that you take to get to work and going like, oh my God, like sea level rise is not just for polar bears, it's also for New York City. And so when you can actually talk to people about this thing that's happening in your neighborhood or in your friend's neighborhood, or you can see what it will do to people, I think that's a really important development. And also to connect it to these other struggles. So when Michael Johnson is saying, we can't breathe, he was also talking about Eric Garner, who was killed by a police officer in New York. And Eric Garner had asthma. So when a police officer put him in an illegal chokehold, he couldn't breathe. But he also couldn't breathe because he'd grown up in a Superfund site in another Black neighborhood where they had put another bunch of polluting industry. And so, when you think about the short term or long term violence that somebody like Eric Garner was facing, you can connect those struggles a lot more easily. And you can think of climate justice as a racial justice fight.
Have you written on that note more about environmental justice? Is that something that you've reported on?
It actually is a thing that I hadn't reported on that much. And when I wrote the proposal for this book, there wasn't a chapter about climate change in it. And I very quickly realized that that needed to change and that it needed to be there. And then, while thinking about the structure and moving chapters around on the outline that was written up on the wall in my office over here, and it realized that it had to sort of be the end. And one of the fun things was that a lot of people that I had talked to for earlier chapters, I ended up circling back to in the end in the climate change chapter. And that includes Debbie Dooley, who's a Tea Party activist who has founded something called the Green Tea Party to advocate for solar power. And so it was really interesting to see people who I had been talking to about banks or about the Tea Party or about, housing, then talking about how they could be part of a movement against climate change.
Since you mentioned Tea Party, let's give the right wing, so to speak, their chance in
Yeah,
this interview.
yeah.
I don't really have a specific question, but how is the Tea Party
Yeah.
going? Is it still effective? Is it still co-opted by the big moneyed interests who are using it for their own devices? Or is there a genuine, sincere, uncorrupted right-wing uprising as well, or
I
social
mean,
movement?
I think that at the beginning of the Tea Party, there were people, when I talked to Debbie Dooley and she tells me that she was angry at the Bush administration for the things that they were doing, I believe her. I think, I don't think she's,
Of course, yeah.
like, right. She's smart enough to know that. And she's also, because she's involved in the Green Tea Party thing, she's actually gone up against like the Koch brothers because they are, of course, very, very deeply invested in dirty energy and in getting government subsidies for their dirty energy, which is a thing that she doesn't like. And so, I think that there's a tendency on the left to think that either the Tea Party is just totally and entirely racist, and that is like sort of like Donald Trump, right? And the two phenomena are obviously deeply connected. There's a tendency to either say that like the only reason this is happening is people are racist, and that the only reason that this is happening is that people are being totally led by this tiny group of billionaires. And I don't think either of those things are true. I think, but I think that they're representative of certain threads that were happening. Obviously, racism is a thing that we are seeing an uptick in right now, which is certainly being fueled by Donald Trump's campaign. And, of course, also backlash to the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement is so powerful. But I think we also have to think about the fact that like most people in this country are struggling. When we say like we are the 99%, that's real, and a good chunk of the 99% considers themselves conservative, but they're also suffering. They're also included in that 50% of America that the Waltons own as much wealth as, right? They're also losing their homes. They're also losing jobs or having wages that are just stagnant or having credit card debt or student loans. And so, I think a lot of the times we're mad at the same things and our answers are very different. And I hope, I don't want to minimize the fact that like political struggle is real. People have very, very different interests, but people have also just very, very different sort of ideological tendencies and solutions that they want. But I thought it was important to include the Tea Party for several of those reasons, but also because I think that the fact that Fox News very deeply invested in the Tea Party and spent a lot of time talking about how great the Tea Party was and how important the Tea Party was and how everybody should go to a Tea Party protest, and like basically, turning itself into one giant ad for the Tea Party,
Right.
legitimize protest movements in a way that the media usually doesn't do, right? Like not the media like you and me, but like the media in, like CNN.
Sure.
They usually don't cover protest movements. And when they do cover them, they're kind of like, who are these weirdos and why don't they just shut up and vote? And so the fact that for once, people who were angry and venting their anger at the government were being portrayed as legitimate and patriotic even was, I think we underestimate how much of an impact that's had on the movements that came up afterwards, that came up on the left.
Well, that would be great if Fox News unleashed some unintended consequences and helped promote all protest movements, not just the Tea Party movement.
It contains the seeds of its own destruction,
Yeah, sure. As we start toward wrapping up, I want to talk a little bit about you and your career. What do you have in the next, in the near future? And so you're a journalist who covers labor movements, economic justice, social movements. What kind of career trajectory do you have? Do you want to be a prominent staff writer for the New York Times? Do you want to be on TV? Do you want to remain freelance? Do you want to dedicate yourself to books? How do you see your trajectory?
Right now I've got to finish. I've got a bunch of travel planned for this book, and I've got to squeeze in writing this article on this trip to North Dakota that I just took. And, I kind of love being able to do things like pack up and go to North Dakota and cover this thing that's happening. My life is pretty all right now. The Nation Institute is a wonderful place to be associated with. They support my reporting. So I'm a freelancer, but I'm a freelancer with some institutional support, which I think is kind of the magic, the happy medium that I enjoy. And, I want to keep covering the things that I think get left out. And that's the stories of protest movements. It's the stories of workers going on strike or getting locked out. Like I should mention the folks at Honeywell here in New York and also in South Bend, Indiana, who've been locked out for most of the summer. These stories that don't get much coverage, but that are part of the bigger story that adds up to why Americans are so mad that 12 million of them voted for a guy who calls himself a socialist and another several million are voting for, a walking angry hairpiece. And so, I kind of think what I do is great. And hopefully there will be enough movements to keep me doing it for a little while. I wouldn't be able to have the career I had without these things, without Occupy, without Wisconsin, without the Fight for 15 erupting enough into people's consciousness that editors were saying, "Oh, somebody should write about this. Hey, Sarah, you pay attention to this stuff, right?" Right. So as long as people keep rising up, I'll keep covering it.
Well, that's okay for the short term, but I hope that these movements have an impact and then they start to fade, because I want to come to a place where we have prosperity and peace and everybody's happy in the country and well distributed.
We want to win. And if we get to a point where everybody's winning, then hopefully we'll all be a little bit more stable and maybe work a little bit less or a lot less, and have universal health care and have some stability. And in that moment, maybe I'll, retire and write fiction.
Sure. Okay. Fill us in a little bit. We're not done yet on what the Nation Institute is. How big is it? What is its mission? How many?
So the Nation Institute is a nonprofit that is separate from but associated with The Nation magazine, and it supports journalism, which is a fantastic thing. So the Nation Institute, I was joking about being their poster child because I was an intern at the magazine, which is funded through the Institute. I was I did a investigative reporting story with a grant from the Nation Investigative Fund a couple of years ago. That was on temp workers in manufacturing, which is fascinating. And now I have a book from Nation Books, which is a project of the Institute, and I'm an Institute reporting fellow, which supports my reporting work and gives me the funding to go do things like fly out to North Dakota. And so and those are most of the programs that the Institute runs, and they've all, in some way or another, support journalism that isn't always, economically I don't know, rewarding, I guess is a good word.
Do they run a website which would be a central repository of all the work that the
Yep,
journalists are
yep.
doing?
There's a Nation Institute website. It links to all the fellows, all of those things. I have my own website that has, most of my work on it, but the website, the page at the Institute also has links to the work that the fellows are doing, links to the investigative fund stories that are supported, links to things that the interns are doing because the interns are excellent. And there's an interview with me done by one of the interns on the website right now, which I think is great.
Well, if we do our job right, your website and the website of the Nation Institute the links will be listed below here.
Yeah, I'll make sure you guys have everything you need.
Video. And the book we've been talking about is Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt by Sarah Jaffe. You can pick this up at your local bookstore or online at the usual book outlets, Amazon, Powell's, etc. I want to follow up later with all of the different characters. And they're not characters, they're real people. So maybe we'll reach out to you, I don't know, a year from now or after this election and see what people think about the circumstances of their country at that time. So thank you very much, Sarah. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, thank you.
And check out the book, check out the links below, and also Sarah's article in the LA Times explaining the origins of Labor Day. That's probably the first thing I'm going to do when we get out here. So thank you very much once again.